Hi, everybody, and welcome to our presentation today from the National Guidelines for Workplace Suicide Prevention. Today, we'll be talking about reducing job strain and toxicity as one of the 9 practices recommended under the national guidelines. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We are recording. Participants are muted. However, we will be able to address questions within the chat. So if you have questions as we're going through, please place them there. The recording will then be posted on YouTube and on our website, workplacesuicideprevention.com. So if you miss it or can't stay for the whole thing or want to send it to someone later, that's where you'll be able to find it. Hello, everybody. I'm Sally Spencer-Thomas, and myself and Jody Jacobson-Fry co-chair the Workplace Suicide Prevention and Postvention Committee of the American Association of Suicidology, AAS, as we like to call it, and United Suicide Survivors International and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention are the 3 collaborative partners, and it's been quite a partnership since our inception. We've enrolled hundreds of stakeholders in the process of developing these guidelines, which are really a living, breathing initiative. As we build out our community of practice, we intend to build these guidelines out further. Our goals today in this webinar are threefold. Why does reducing job strain and job toxicity matter to suicide prevention? What are the forms of job strain that are connected to suicide prevention, and how best do we reduce harm in this situation? The national guidelines revolve around 8 guiding principles and 9 practices. So if we think about the 8 guiding principles that are connected to the national guidelines, one of the 8 principles is this idea of harm reduction, that we should do as much as possible to help our workplaces be free from job strain or toxicity. And that, of course, is linked to the practice of reducing job strain. So why is this important to suicide prevention, and what does this practice actually entail? I'm going to start off with a story not well known in the United States, but certainly well known in Europe. A large telecom company called France Telecom had a spate of suicides spanning over a few years from 2010 to 2015 or so. Upwards of 80, depending on how who you listen to and how you calculate it. 80 people died by suicide in this very large company over that period of time. And a lot of people attributed what happened in that company to management by terror. It was a large government-controlled company that needed to downsize significantly over a short period of time, but they couldn't downsize because the employees were tenured in. And so what happened was that the managing team started to use really toxic management strategies of micromanaging and taking people who had high-level engineering positions and downsizing their job to something like customer service, and where they had to even ask permission to use the toilet. And all of these things started happening that were really making the work unimaginably difficult and stressful for the employees. And it started to be that people would take their lives, and in their suicide notes, they would attribute their suicide to the toxic work environment. People would also take their lives at the job site, which is not very common. And again, making a statement in their death that this workplace was toxic. So this led to a number of union protests and worker protests over the years, saying that the workplace was not conducive, was conducive to a lot of strain and trauma and distress. But what really made this case unique was that the bosses were held accountable. So over the summer of 2019, years and years later, it took a long time to get all the class action stuff to get to the criminal level, but they held a trial in France over the summer, accusing the C-level leaders of this company with being responsible for the deaths of I think about 30 families came forward in the suit, that workplace bullying led to their deaths. And sure enough, in December of 2019, the verdict came forward and the bosses were held accountable. Several of them went to prison, and large fines were held against the company. So this is an unprecedented case study. There's been other companies that have gone to trial, but they've not been in a criminal case. So this now sets a precedent for companies being held responsible for bullying and toxic management styles that then result in death. This is an overwhelming slide by design, this is the summary of all of the, what we call the psychosocial hazards that show up at work, how each of these is connected to increased suicide risk of one form or another, either increased risk of suicidal thoughts, attempts, or death. So it's an overwhelming list because the list is large, and I have one of the main references at the end. But it's things that are clustering around job autonomy, job variety, and job control. Is my intellectual wellness appreciated here at work? Then we've got another cluster that's things like work and family, family and work, conflict of how one is spilling over into the other. We've got another cluster around bullying, hazing, harassment, prejudice, and discrimination. And then probably my favorite to address is work-related sleep disruption, which is a potential hazard for a lot of workplaces, but specifically for workplaces that operate round the clock. Somebody's going to have their sleep disrupted. Somebody's going to be sleeping at weird hours, and how important sleep is to overall well-being, and how as workplaces, we really do need to get creative in helping people get better sleep. If we link this idea of workplace hazards, job strain, and job toxicity onto some of the tools and frameworks that we already know are familiar with workplaces, especially safety conscious workplaces, we can now look at NIOSH's Hierarchy of Controls. It's a framework very well understood and guides implementation across a number of safety conscious industries. And if you think about it from a public health standpoint, it makes a lot of sense that at the top of the pyramid, where we're going to have the most impact in reducing incidence and mortality and morbidity, is by fixing the environment, that we really need to look at eliminating threats to psychological safety, eliminating these or reducing elements of job strain and job toxicity and protective factors. We're going to be far more successful looking upstream and doing those things than we are looking at the bottom of the pyramid, which is what I say is, helping troubled workers get to counselors. Now, workers that are undergoing a lot of distress and mental health conditions and suicidal despair absolutely need to get connected to supports. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying we're going to be more effective if we actually look at some of the drivers of those despairs that are connected to workplace environmental conditions. So in terms of action steps and resources, very briefly, we're recommending that the first thing that workplaces do is actually step back and create space to listen to workers. Listen to the workers talk about what are the biggest elements of job strain and job toxicity that need to be addressed. What are those psychosocial hazards? And in doing so, create a safe place for these grievances by having things like, so that they can share and we can look at patterns in those responses. And then once we have a sense of what those big psychosocial hazards are, then we need to work collaboratively to help mitigate those hazards and do things like helping, again, find creative ways for workers to prioritize family connections, sleep, and a sense of community, to eliminate or reduce as much as possible the hazing, bullying, discrimination, and prejudice. And again, to find new ways of increasing job security when possible, or helping people transition from one job to another, increasing opportunities for job autonomy and job variety, among other things. So in conclusion, here are some references and resources that are tied to this particular practice. NIOSH's Fundamentals of Total Worker Health Approaches, Essential Elements for Advancing Worker Safety, Health, and Well-Being is one. The meta-analysis study that I referred to that listed many of the psychosocial hazards in the previous slide was done by my dear friend, the late Allison Milner, whose work we will carry on proudly. And then another resource is how to have an effective town hall meeting where people can continue to have conversations that will produce some constructive dialogue about solutions. So our final call to action to everybody is to take the pledge, make suicide prevention a health and safety priority in your workplace or in your professional association. You can do that through by going to our website, workplacesuicideprevention.com. Take the pledge there and you will become part of the community of practice. And with that, I will close.